Hello and welcome, everyone. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. You're listening to My Strategy. We're on the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Well, very happy to be here with you today and really glad that you could join us as well. My Strategy episodes are live. They're on Saturdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. Today, we're going to be talking about your perspective matters. We're going to talk about seeing things from a different perspective or viewpoint. We're going to talk about the dark side of perspective, the essential leadership skills that you need to develop. We're going to pull all that together and hopefully help you build a strategy to see things from a different viewpoint. Well, again, very happy to be here with you today. Saturday for me is a great day to reflect. It's the day of the week that I choose to start thinking about my goals or continually think about my goals. But keep in mind that any time is a good time to assess your strategy. As we mentioned in the past, the show is growing. We're now available on iHeart, iTunes, Player FM, YouTube, SoundCloud, Spreaker, and more. You can go there to listen to past podcasts. We also are on YouTube. There's a live stream portion of the show that you can find out there on YouTube. So if you want to see me and doing the show, I am out there on YouTube. You can find us on most social platforms. You can find me specifically at Hawkins John. That's on Twitter. Or you can go to johnmhawkins.com if you prefer the website. And just like anything in life, we need to have a strategy and a plan to help us reach our goals because the best laid plans don't always work. This week, I'm looking for stories on perspective. Do you have any good tips, tricks, or examples of how to see things from a different viewpoint? You can send those to talk at johnmhawkins.com. That's talk at johnmhawkins.com. Also, if you'd like to be on the show, we might have an opportunity for you. So if you're interested in those opportunities, you can also send an email to talk at johnmhawkins.com. We are giving away weekly. We give away a subscription. To our top submission, we give away a copy of my latest book, Coach to Greatness, and also a $25 Visa gift card. So perspective matters. Today we're talking about perspective. We're going to be talking about how perspective shapes our daily lives. Just like a coin has two sides, pancakes have two sides. Perspective can have multiple sides as well. Talk a little bit about our perspective versus the reality. Now, leaders have to have perspective, so we're going to talk a little bit about the leadership viewpoint with respect to perspective taking, perspective seeking, and perspective coordinating. We're then going to have a few exercises that we're going to go through to help us look at things from a different vantage point, a different view. You know, how would different people in your life take or make decisions that are different than how you might look at it? What about in a business situation, career, personal life? We're going to talk a little bit about the power of perspective taking, some of the benefits, and as I hopefully had mentioned prior, the dark side of perspective taking. Is it always good to look at things from a different viewpoint? Research suggests that in some cases, it isn't good. Got an article here from Paul White. Paul White wrote an article called How It Shapes Our Daily Lives. He says, the importance of perspective is becoming more clear to me all the time. Perspective implies a viewpoint, a place from which we are looking at our lives and the world around us. Pick a specific spot, physical location that you have been in your life. Might have been a beautiful vista overlooking the Grand Canyon, the top of a mountain in Colorado, at the bottom of a valley next to a rushing mountain river, or hiking in the fall foliage of Vermont. Now, change your perspective. He says, look at that spot from an airplane at 30,000 feet above it. What do you notice about that spot? Is it smaller? A single piece of data now in a huge vista of land, trees, rivers, valleys, and clouds. Or change the type of perspective that you are using. Think about it as being in a spot of a 4-year-old. What would a 4-year-old see? What things you noticed? What looks big to you? then go there as a 20-year-old. How does who you are change what you see and focus on? Then he says, come back as a 70-year-old adult with probable physical limitations you might have. How does your experience, thoughts, feelings differ from this vantage point in life? Why? It is valuable to understand the importance of perspective in our lives, he says, because if we don't, we are severely at risk for misinterpreting much of what is going on around us. And this is important not only in our personal lives, but also our business dealings. If we are working on our career path, if we have any sort of interpersonal relationships, getting the right perspective matters. Just take your current life situation, age, relationship status, work, school stage, the neighborhood, and home in which you live, what kind of vehicle you drive, where you plan a vacation this summer, the activities around you that your family are involved with, how much your sense of satisfaction or contentment is related to your neighbors or friends or circumstances in the same area. Are you discontent because one of your friends drives a newer, nicer car than you? Or that one of your siblings and their family member is taking longer, more luxurious vacations? Well, getting the right perspective can help. Dr. Phil has some thoughts on perspective. We've got an article written by Dr. Phil called The Powerful Ability That Will Help You Manage Your Life. Dr. Phil says no matter how flat you make a pancake, it still has two sides. He says one of the greatest limitations we face as human beings is that we look at the world from our own subjective perspective, especially in situations that directly involve us. Anytime there's something personal at stake, you've got a built-in bias, right? But it doesn't have to be one-sided. If you can develop your ability to really see through another person's eyes, you'll be tapping into an incredibly powerful tool that you can use to manage your life, and it's a skill you can cultivate, just like flipping a pancake. He then goes on to talk about a job he had where he had to train salespeople. And he says there was a refrain that they often used in this training. If I'm going to sell what Bill buys, Bill's the customer, I'd better see it through Bill's eyes. You don't have to work in sales to benefit from that mindset. In fact, I attribute much of my success to the ability to ferret out how a situation could look to others. He goes on to say that you might assume that the way to come out on top is to focus relentlessly on your own agenda, desires, and needs. But he says that is what narcissists do. And narcissists are not effective players in the game of life. Self-obsession will only take you so far. How can you influence other people if you can't connect with them in a meaningful way? You glean tremendous insight when you understand someone else's currency, feelings, and circumstances. And he says that's why you've always got to work to flip that pancake. You're listening to My Strategy. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. When we come back, we're going to talk about leadership and perspective. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins. You're listening to My Strategy. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. We're very happy to be here with you today. Glad you could join us. Today we're talking about perspective and how seeing things from a different perspective or viewpoint can help us, but it can also hurt us. There's a dark side there. If you'd like to, we'd love to get your phone calls later in the show. We do have a studio number open, which will be open later in the show at 866-451-1451. The number again is 866-451-1451. So we'll take those calls later. But you can also send your thoughts to talk@johnmhawkins.com. That's talk@johnmhawkins.com. Right before the break, we were talking about perspective matters. We talked about how perspective shapes our daily lives, how coins have two sides, pancakes have two sides, and if we flip the pancake or the coin, we see the other side. I want to talk in this segment a little bit about leadership. Leaders have perspective. Specifically, there's some skills we can learn from leaders to help us be better, do a better job of looking at things from a different perspective. Got an article here called Why Understanding Other Perspective is a Key Leadership Skills. It's by Stefan Sertic. It says here in one of the management courses that I deliver as well as with clients I coach, one of my favorite topics to cover is the understanding of perspective. Participants often tell me this is one of their key takeaways. For me, there's great value in recognizing different perspective in conversations because these enable us to hear and react to things very differently. One of my close friends often says, change how a situation occurs to you and change how you will respond to that situation. I think that's worth repeating. Change how a situation occurs to you and change how you respond to the situation, how you will respond. He says here, what is the distinction between perception and reality? There's a lot of fun expressions around this topic. The easiest one is my perspective is my reality. Well, why not? That's what the narcissist would do. My perspective is my reality. Well, perhaps not the narcissist, but it's a good perspective. But is this really true, or is there a difference between the two? Perspective is the way individuals see the world. It comes from their personal point of view and is shaped by life experiences, values, their state of mind, the assumptions they bring into situations, and a whole lot of other things. Reality can be different. We easily say that my perspective is my reality. There is the truth to that statement. There's truth to that statement. But when we start looking at the shared reality of an event, the more perspectives you get, the more closer to reality. He suggests 3 skills that we need to learn if we're going to be good leaders. The first key skill is called perspective taking. He calls it a beautiful skill we have as human beings is the capability to take a different perspective. He says one beautiful skill we have. For fun, try this. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself taking the point of view of one of your employees. Can you reach that point? Ask yourself, as an employee, what do I want? And take the time to ask yourself, as an employee, what do I fear? What do the answers to these questions look like when you take that different perspective? If you look at it from a manager or executive, how will those answers differ? And you've come up with your answers, but what exactly will the employee say? That's perspective taking. What is perspective seeking? He suggests a second skill that he refers to as perspective seeking. Now that you can consciously listen to the perspectives of others or see them, can you see it simply as a perspective? Meaning you're not attaching emotion or judging it, saying that it is good or bad. Just see it as a perspective. The skill is about reaching out to people and better understanding their point of view on a specific topic or situation. It is about being truly and authentically curious without hearing and learning more about their perspective. He says the biggest trap of perspective seeking is reaching out to people who have the same point of view as you as a way to validate the hard decisions you want to make. The richness of using this skill is actually hearing from people who may have a different point of view than you and discovering potential blind spots or new things to consider. Isn't that one of the benefits of diversity and getting thoughts from different people, from people who come from a different perspective? Maybe that's what diversity is all about, getting the thoughts of people and their perspective. Next one is, what is perspective coordinating? He says the final key skill that he refers to as perspective coordinating, he says, now that you can take the perspectives of others and seek them out as well, what can you do with all that information that you receive? This is perspective coordinating. He says the first thing you can do is to observe what you can learn from other perspectives you received. What does it tell you about each person you spoke to and how they see their world? What is the impact of the decision or situation on them? How can you communicate back to them using information they give you about their perspective? How does considering these different viewpoints contribute to your understanding of the situation and help you in decision making? Another thing you can do is to observe how wide or small their perspective is. Are they seeing the bigger picture? Can you give them any information to help widen their perspective? If so, what change does this create to their point of view? So we've got three different skills he wants us to learn. Perspective taking. Close your eyes. Imagine it from a different vantage point. Perspective seeking. Now that we can consciously listen, can we just view their perspective? Can we reach out to people and better understand their viewpoint on a specific topic? And once we have those two pieces of information, we want to coordinate it. Perspective coordinating. Bring that information together. Start to figure out how these things fit together. It says we live in a world that goes fast, where people do not always take the time to step back, but when going fast, leaders often confuse their perspective and reality and have a truly difficult time understanding the point of views of others. And it makes sense, right? Even your own day, your own life, you're so busy doing things and keeping up with what you know you need to do that you have a set context, a set perspective. And that perspective is not going to change unless you actively make a choice to change it. You're listening to My Strategy. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Well, when we come back, we're going to talk about a way to see things from a different view. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins. You're listening to My Strategy. We're on the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Today we're talking about your perspective matters. What's it like seeing things from a different perspective or a different viewpoint? Talking about the darker sides of perspective, essential leadership skills, and ways to develop your strategy. Later in the show, we're taking phone calls. Our studio number is 866-451-1451, 866-451-1451. But you are welcome to send an email now to talk@johnmhawkins.com. That's talk@johnmhawkins.com. And you can be entered into the weekly giveaway. Love to get your thoughts on perspective. We're also entertaining the idea of having some new perspectives on the show. So if you'd like to be on the show, send an email to talk@johnmhawkins.com. Right before the break, we were talking about leadership and how leaders have perspective. And in this segment, I want to talk a little bit more about things that we can do to see things from a different viewpoint. How would different people in your life view a situation? Right before we talked about in the business world, but what about your life? We want to talk a little bit about what about in a business situation, your career? How do we see things from a different perspective? Got an article here called Life from a Different Perspective. Got a very cute picture of a kitty who is upside down. The article was written by William Martin. William Martin has over 30 years experience. And he wrote this article on perspective. He says, there's much evidence to show that those who recover from painful events are those who find something meaningful in the experience. In our formative years, we tend to look at others to help us understand the world and help us see it from a meaningful event. Afterwards, we tend to make the same assumption as those around us as we were growing up. If we do not learn to question those assumptions, we could still be applying other people's assumptions to our own current life circumstances, and these may or may not be useful. Our assumptions may be blocking our ability to find meaning in the kind of experiences that challenge us. What that means is that everyone has a context. We talked about whether you were on the ground in Vermont and had the ability to look at everything around you, or if you're at 30,000 feet. Your age mattered, whether you were a small child or a 70-year-old looking at that situation. What he's suggesting here is that the context, the perspective, might be set by those we are growing up with. And if we take and apply that context everywhere we go, our perspective becomes set. And it becomes more difficult for us to see different perspectives. He says, we all have experiences that we find difficult, yet we know that other types of people may simply breeze through exactly the same situation. Whether we find something is easy or difficult has a lot to do with the assumptions we make about the meaning of the event or the meaning of someone's behavior. If we are confident, we may interpret new experiences as an opportunity. If we don't feel confident, we may experience it as a threat. When we respond differently, we get different results. So how you go about approaching a situation may have a direct impact on the outcome of it. He says, learning new life-enhancing ways of responding. He says, we can change our assumptions and change how we interpret the events by loosening up our habitual ways of responding. We can break out of our well-worn paths of thinking and feeling and learn new ways. The new way of feeling may feel odd at first. And I think this is what personal development's all about. But he says, the new ways may be feeling a bit odd at first, but they will give us a wider range of options for our thinking and feeling. We will have more choices in how we interpret and experience the events in our lives, and so are more able to adapt and respond in life-enhancing ways. He gives us a simple exercise. He says, the exercise below helps us tap into our inner wisdom and to see events and circumstances from a different perspective. It's a way to find meaning in what others might seem to be baffling or meaningless events. We can use this technique for past events or current situations. We allow the item to come to mind and then ask ourselves the question like, what if I choose? And would I choose this? You do not need to believe that you actually did choose. He says that's not the point. He says you are not being asked to believe anything else. He says the exercise is not about what you believe or don't believe. So the point of the exercise is to create a frame for your thinking, which strengthens your capacity to find hidden meanings and hidden insight about yourself and your life. If you're looking at something from a vantage point or a viewpoint that's set, and it could have been set at a young childhood, could have been a traumatic event that happened to you, you're not looking at it from all different perspectives, all different sides. He's saying if you look at it from a different perspective and ask yourself the question, what if I choose it? Why would I choose this? You might open up your mind and start to at least look at it from a different perspective. This exercise also helps you break out of your normal way of looking at things and helps you look at new ways of thinking, feeling, responding. He calls it the mental yoga. He gives us some exercises that we can try in perception. He says, part 1, allow an unhappy experience or situation to come into your mind. So I'm going to think about my unhappy experience, perhaps a situation. And he's asking me to say, what if I choose it? Would there be any good reason to choose it? Would anyone ever have a good reason to choose this? He says, don't be harsh or blame yourself. Just open to the possibilities. Part 2, he says, ask yourself, what is the craziest, most far out, modern day person you would know would say about choosing it, and write down their likely responses. What would your best friend say? What would your favorite comedian say? What would a wise old man say who's lived in a cave for 20 years? What would really annoying, smart-ass, know-it-all type of person say about it? Getting their perspective, their view, and going through that exercise might help you look at things from a different view. You're listening to My Strategy. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. We're on the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Well, when we come back, we're going to talk about the dark side of taking someone else's perspective. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. You're listening to My Strategy. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. Well, if you're just joining us, really glad that you could join us. You're listening to My Strategy episodes, which are live and on Saturdays at 10 a.m., 1 p.m. Pacific. Today we're talking about Your Perspective Matters. We've been talking about how seeing things from a different viewpoint, a different perspective, can impact us. We're talking about the dark sides of perspective, essential leadership skills, and ways to develop your strategy. Right before the break, we were talking about a way we can look at things from a different perspective, and we got a couple of tips and tricks on an experiment we could do to do that. What I want to talk about in this episode, in this segment, is the power of perspective taking. Being able to step into someone else's shoes is an important skill. We talked about that, for any leader. But there's also some downsides to looking at perspective. And I've got an article here by Jillian Koo. It's called The Power of Perspective Taking. And if you'll recall, earlier in the show, we talked about the three different types of ways we can gain perspective. The perspective taking, the perspective seeing, and the perspective coordinating, which are skills that all good leaders should learn. He says here that successful leadership requires you navigate your way through all sorts of choppy organizational waters, or personal waters in that case. He says you have to figure out what drives your customers and employees, negotiate with clients and suppliers, manage diversity, resolve conflicts, and this is all in a day's work. Learning to see things or situations from another's perspective can help with all of these challenges, says Jillian Koo, who is an associate professor of organizational behavior at the London Business School. Her research on perspective taking, the active cognitive process of imagining the world from another's vantage point, suggests many potential benefits for managers and leaders. Perspective taking is another important life skill, according to Dr. Q. It's not to be confused with empathy, which is its emotional cousin. Empathy is the feeling the other person is feeling. She says perspective taking is a cognitive phenomenon, a thought process. It's a process that begins with childhood. We start out with more ecocentric worldview, then learn to adjust to how we see things to accommodate others' viewpoints. She says that this is incredibly important at this point, especially in the world of politics, and how right now we've got two very different viewpoints. We have a position on one side that sees things in one context and one perspective, and we have a position on the other side who sees things in one way or one context. And they're not talking. They're not able to see things from the other's perspective. She says there's a lot of benefits of perspective taking, as we learned about earlier. Psychologists have been investigating this phenomenon of perspective taking for nearly a century. Sorry, a century, not a half a century. So we know a lot about how it works. She says one example of how perspective taking could have an impact on managers. It has repeatedly been found to decrease prejudice and stereotyping, which ties in with organizations' need to harness the benefits of employee diversity. Goes on to go through some of the experience with respect to diversity and how that impacts. It says, learning to take perspective, to do the perspective take. Some factors make people naturally more likely to take others' perspective. Maybe we are destined to take others' perspective. We know, for example, that cognitive capacity can affect perspective taking. How well you perceive different and integrate information has a bearing on your ability to look at a situation from a different perspective, as do factors such as being pressed for time or simply having too much time to think about. Cognitive overload. Well, this is an interesting point. Perhaps you are more highly tuned at seeing others' perspective, and that's a skill you already have. And maybe it's working well for you, or maybe it's not. The reason I say it's not is because She goes on to talk about the dark side of perspective taking. She says there's a twist in this tale. Perspective taking doesn't always have such benevolent and positive effects. For instance, in 2013, Nero Srinivathan, an associate professor of organizational behavior, and others explored perspective taking in the context of cooperation versus competition. They asked participants to engage in a game in which they had limited shared resources and measured whether participants would lie about the amount of resources they had if they viewed each other as a competitor or a collaborator. In competitive situations, perspective takers expected their counterparts to behave unethically and trusted them less, which resulted in deceiving them more. Well, this is interesting. Aren't we talking about looking at things from a different person's perspective? She says here, these negative effects of perspective taking on ethical behavior in competitive context seems to create a self-protection at any cost mindset, says Dr. Koo, referring to Dr. Srinivathan's research. The combination of perspective taking and competitive changes the golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. 2, do unto others as you think they would do unto you. Similarly, when individuals identify strongly with and are highly committed to their own group, perspective taking can result in negative effects for those who aren't in the fold. In addition, perspective takers who strongly identify with their own group feelings towards guilt wronged people on the outside. Interesting. Dr. Koo suggests how to reconcile perspective taking diverse benevolent and malevolent effects. The world is filled with mixed motive interactions. When a perspective taker interacts with someone who has a positive intentions, we get all the positive benefits. But when a perspective taker interacts with a person who has negative intentions toward them, they act more competitively and less ethically versus a controlled condition. All of a sudden, it becomes a fight fire with fire mentality. As such, perspective taking is a skill that allows individuals to navigate a world that is filled with mixed motives, a world where some people are cooperative and collaborative and others are competitive and merciless. I want to think about that. Cooperative and collaborative versus competitive and merciless. Brings new meaning to walk a mile in someone's shoes. We have to be careful whose shoes we are walking in. You're listening to My Strategy. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Well, when we come back, we're going to talk about ways you can build your strategy on perspective. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. You're listening to My Strategy. We're on the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. We're very happy to be here with you today. Really glad you could join us. Today we're talking about perspective. Right before the break, we were talking about the power of perspective taking. And the thing we closed off with was, we're talking about these three different ways we can gain perspective with perspective taking, perspective seeing, and perspective coordinating. The thing we left off with was a quote from Dr. Koo, who said, as such, perspective taking is a skill that allows individuals to navigate a world that is filled with mixed motives. A world where some people are cooperative and collaborative and others are competitive and merciless. Well, that kind of stuck with me, so I wanted to emphasize that. In this segment, I want to talk a little bit about how we can create our strategy. And we do have a framework that we use to create a strategy. And as I think about this, there's 5 different steps to creating our strategy. Number 1 is the awareness. We want to think about what is our vision, what are our goals, what is it we are hoping to achieve. Core values have an impact on us as well. What are our core values? And as you think about it with respect to perspective, how does perspective fit into your vision, your goals? Would developing a better perspective on the world, on people, on how things work help you? Or are you one of those people who is so into other people's perspective, what they think, what they are feeling, how they view you, that you are unable to move forward? Can go both ways. As we talked about, a coin has 2 sides, or a pancake has 2 sides. So as we're thinking about our strategy, we really want to think about what are we trying to accomplish here. We then want to start thinking about it from an assessment and analysis perspective. When we assess a situation and do some analysis, we can figure out the steps we need to take. What isn't working? Are we having issues making decisions? Is it you? So as we went through the show, we talked about perspective taking, perspective seeing, perspective coordinating. If I were to assess and analyze my own skills with regard to how I look at things from a different perspective, I might say, well, I do a good job at seeing things from a different perspective. But if I went through some of the exercises and wrote it down, remember the generation effect, if we are actively engaged in generating something, we have the ability to remember it, and it's going to be more clear to us. So maybe I should go through that step, and after I go through that step, I might find that, well, wait a minute, my observation and where I thought I was isn't where I am. I probably have some work that I can do with regard to seeing things from a different perspective. In fact, personally, I know I do. They also, if you're a leader, we did talk about it earlier, that leaders do get into a place where they do stop looking at things from a different perspective. And it's not only the leader, it's also those who work for organizations, those who are in relationships. It's easy to be caught up and consumed with our own day-to-day, our own busy lives, or life activities, to the point where we lose our perspective. So that's one thing we can do, is go through some of these exercises and figure out exactly where we are. Once we've got an assessment, the current state of the situation, we then can start to strategize and plan. Now, we've been doing a course of actions up until this point. Every day we do actions, we do tasks, we do activities. Which are the ones that we are doing that impact perspective? Which are the ones that we are doing that we need to start to look at? We need to identify those courses of actions. Figure out where we are spending our time. What are we doing when we wake up, at lunchtime, in the afternoon, in the evening? If perspective is something we need to work on, and we're interacting with certain people, how is it that we are perceiving them? Is our perspective the same at work as it is at home, as it is at school, as it is with the man or woman on the street? Might be changing. So as you start to think about that from a strategy and plan perspective, we want to start to look at specific things, specific activities, specific actions that we could be doing differently in our daily lives so that we have the ability to either gain more perspective or perhaps change our perspective or not look at somebody from only their perspective and start to look at our own perspective. And I think these skills are something that, regardless of whether you're at work, school, no matter where you are, community, think about how you look at things from others' perspectives. Or do you? In some situations, you might be brilliant at looking at things from other perspectives at home, but at work, you're not as good. So once we've identified those actions, those areas that we want to be focusing on, we need to implement our plan, because if you don't implement the plan, it is just a plan. So how are we going to implement these new tactics, these new actions that we're going to be doing? We have to change something, and change isn't easy. Change is hard. And if it is if an action that we're trying with regard to gaining others' perspective isn't working, others' vantage point or view, why isn't it working? Which means that we need to reach out to others if we can't solve the problem ourselves. Do you have a role model? Do you have somebody you can ask? What about if you are in the work context? Are there resources at work that you can, talk to? Are there buddies that you have? Do you have somebody at home? This is where the professionals and specialists really come into play. They have the ability to look at things from a different perspective. They have the ability to look at it from their vantage point. They can put on multiple hats because they've seen other people in similar situations as yours make various choices, and as a result, they know. And if they don't know, they might be able to help you. That's all part of what it takes to create your strategy. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network. You're listening to My Strategy, and I am your host, John M. Hawkins. When we come back, we're going to talk about ways that you can put your plan in place. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio, and you've been listening to My Strategy. Today we're talking about perspective matters. We've been talking about how we want to see things from a different viewpoint. We've also talked about the dark side of perspective, some leadership skills. Today in this segment, we're going to be talking about my recommendations and how you can put your plan in place. And just in case you missed this broadcast, you can listen on iHeartRadio and Apple iTunes. Or if you'd like to have something covered in the show, you can send an email to talk@johnmhawkins.com or give us a call at 1-844-MY-STRATEGY. That's 1-844-MY-STRATEGY. Well, we've been talking about perspective matters, and this has been a personally fulfilling show for me. I think I've learned a lot. We've talked about the perspective and how it can shapes our lives. How a coin has two sides, pancakes have two sides, as Dr. Phil suggested, and how we sometimes need to flip it over and look at it from a new perspective, and how our perspective might be different from the reality. And it's very difficult to look at things from a different perspective. It's very, difficult in some cases to see things. We also learned that leaders have perspective, and we learned 3 important tactics that we can use to see perspective. The first one is perspective taking, then perspective seeing, and perspective coordinating. Being able to look at things from a different viewpoint, from a different vantage point, can help us. We want to be able to look at things from the perspective of a young person, a young boy, or an old person, middle-aged person. How do we look at it from someone in a different situation than our own? How would a boss look at it? How would a coworker look at the situation? And once we've gone out and done our perspective taking and seeing, I think it's important for us to coordinate all of that information together and have something that we can then tangibly look at and start to do our analysis and say, where are we with respect to how we look at other situations? And it might be that it's not just how we look at other things, but the people we're closest to, the people we interact with, might have the wrong perspective. And as a coach, would we then be able to talk to them and help them see things from a different perspective? So leadership not only has the ability to use these skills, but they can coach others to make others that much better. We then talked about how we could try some things and do things at home where we can look at things from a different perspective and really start to think about a situation and then think about the people we know. How would my brother respond? How would my sister respond? How would my mother respond? How would somebody who's, man or woman from the moon respond? How would they think about it? And if we start to think about this from this perspective, it might give us better insight. Also, there's a context that has been set when we are young, and the context is set from those of us, from those that we've interacted with. Is it possible that we are using that same filter as we move forward and we're not growing, we're not adapting? It's a real possibility. So we want to make sure if we are in that situation, we have the ability to gain new perspective. We talked about the benefits of perspective, but also there's a dark side. And, if we do try and gain the perspective of somebody who we feel is Maleficent, or, well, Maleficent is a Disney character, but somebody who is not nice, then we have the ability to become, fearful. We start to react differently. And finally, we can take all that and put it into play. But it does come down to the fact that breaking habits isn't easy. We need to become aware, and it takes conscious prioritization and planning, and also a commitment. You've been listening to My Strategy. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. So happy to be here with you today. Glad you could join us, and we'll see you next time.